Priya, thank you for your kind words of introduction. Dr. Tharoor, sir, thank you for your eloquent description of my work. To share this platform with you is an honor. On my 15th birthday, amidst the quintessential celebrations that accompany such an occasion, my grandfather gently signaled to come to his room. Tearing away from my friends and family, rather reluctantly, I went to him. My eyes lit up when he whispered that he had a gift for me. Having already received a present from him that morning, like any other teenager, my excitement broke all boundaries, and I waited patiently seated on his favorite divan, expecting either a pair of Nike sneakers or the latest Levi's jeans. Maybe if I was really lucky, the soundtracks of the chart-busting English band Wham. But I could quickly tell that he had been rummaging through his old antique Portuguese cover that he had brought from Surat. Papers were all over the place. Some of them were covered with dreaded white ants, and some had terrible rust marks of old withering steel clips on them. One thing was for sure, there wasn't a chance that I was going to get the latest Nike sneakers, and neither was George Michael going to emerge from that antiquated heap. Disappointment descended. Grandfather was weak with age and wore the telltale signs of having been overcome by his exertions in trying to locate a very old relic. But as soon as he held this relic, in my mind, in his hands, almost alarmingly to me, he seemed emboldened with great energy and pride. He walked towards me, holding in his hand what at that time I thought was just another old book, very old antiquated letters. But standing tall, his chin up, he then sat beside me. The cover of the book read, Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill, Debate in the House of Commons, 1856. Then grandfather's frail fingers slowly attempted at turning each brittle page. Time had been so unkind to those pages that every time he turned a page, I could hear a soft rustle that tore the page even further. Yes, he had spotted in me a love for history. He had noted that while I was an average student, in most other subjects, I was getting an A in history. To him, it didn't seem to matter if my math tuition teacher left the house screaming in utter frustration at my abysmal scores in mathematics. But what was important to him was that I proudly knew that we Indians invented the zero, and then the modern numerical system stemmed from there. It was vitally important for him to know that I knew that it was Al-Khwarizmi who invented logarithm, and because the West could not pronounce his name, they called it logarithm. It didn't matter to him whether I could actually work a logarithm, and I could not. I was a failure at that. But as long as I knew its historical origins, I had a happy grandfather. But that day on my 15th birthday, while he attempted at taking me through this antique book, the other end of the house was reverberating with a classic rock and roll song from John Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer. And some of my friends I could see from the corner of my eye were gesticulating to me frantically to leave the room of history and enter the room of rock and roll. I must admit, I felt a strong tug towards John Bon Jovi. And then something happened. Just as grandfather was closing the book and putting away those old letters, some words swept past my eyes. They were powerful words on very brittle paper. Precisely, the words were such. I strongly protest against the injustice of the English East India Company towards my infant daughters. Never will I give in. And then more powerful words. We are gathered here in the House of Commons appealing for justice. This is the call for the birthrights of 2 infant children. And if treaties cannot be honored, then sooner the British government terminated in Hindustan, the better. Grandfather realized that my eyes had frozen on those words, and he said, keep the book with you, it will change your life. Know him, for he sleeps unknown to the world, and in time tell his story, for maybe you will see images in this old book rather than just words. I took the book and left the room of history for the room of rock and roll and John Bon Jovi, while grandfather resigned himself to earplugs and reciting Urdu poetry of Jigar Muradabadi. But those powerful words that I had glanced upon stayed with me. The book went into my bookshelf and life carried on. I moved to London as a student and then as a professional. Grandfather had long passed away. But I had carried that antique book with me that had so accurately minuted the heated debate in British Parliament in 1856. Who was this Indian challenging the might of the British Empire in its own parliament? I needed to know more. And so the research began. Ours at the British Library in King's Cross, the London Library at St. James's Square, the Asiatic Library in Bombay, and the family archives revealed a thrilling and riveting story that I thought needed to be told. On the 11th of June, 1856, just before India erupted in flames in the War of Independence, that the British would call the Revolt of 1857, one Indian confidently walked into Parliament, British House of Commons. It was the bastion of British political establishment, and he was spearheading the greatest legal resistance against the injustices of the English East India Company. His name was Mir Jafar Ali Khan. He was there in the heart of Victorian England, amidst the most powerful movers and shakers of the British Empire, pressing them on the injustices of their own colonizing corporation. He was telling a compelling story to the British people and making a formidable and brave argument that exposed the malpractices of their own East India Company on their own home soil. In 1800, the English East India Company forcibly annexed Surat, but not with the objective of building on its legacy as India's greatest port and emporia of maritime trade, but with the goal of destroying its trading prowess. This the English company did by fostering corrupt practices and overcoming by force the local Nawabs. Eventually, the company signed a treaty with the Nawab that would secure his family and descendants for generation to generation. But typical of the tyrannical and corrupt practices of the company, the treaty was violated. Ruthlessly, the company stopped the income of the family, took away every house, including palaces and private homes, estates, orchards, gardens, even clothing and jewelry of little girls were stolen, leaving the last Nawab's infant granddaughters on the brink of destitution and poverty. By 1856, the fate of those two little girls hung by a thread. Mir Jafar Ali Khan, father of the two girls, stood to defy an empire and devoted his struggle to ensure that his girls had a future that stood devastated at the hands of the English East India Company. The East India Company in 1856 was the wealthiest colonizing corporation in the world. And it's so important to understand that it was a company that was colonizing us. It was at the forefront of empire expansion. It had the most powerful stakeholders and prominent British MPs, lords, dukes, earls, businessmen, barons. Its army in Hindustan stood close to 300,000, making it the most powerful army in the subcontinent. And yet, at the peak of its powers, this man chose to oppose them on their home soil. He had given up all that he possessed in India to take the good fight into their own parliament. Through his years of struggle in London, he came to occupy a unique position in Victorian England. He had over many years in England meticulously planned and mobilized the most powerful alliances in the British political establishment to challenge the company. Voyaging twice to England, first in 1844 and then in 1853, he went on to become one of the most well-known figures in Victorian England. Backed by the British press, which, besides carrying reports on his sharp features and good looks, carried daily reports on his campaign for justice. What made his character utterly fascinating was his multidimensional personality. At the age of 13, he had studied the Vedas. At the age of 15, he had mastered the Sufi works of Umar Khayyam and Ghazali and immersed himself in the philosophy of Sufism. At the age of 16, he had defeated a violent tribe in battle. By the age of 26, he had voyaged to Britain and understood democracy, the legal functioning of the British judiciary, had gone into the headquarters of the English East India Company and boldly protested against their injustices. Between the age of 35 and 40, he was navigating the political divide in Victorian England, masterfully crafting his arguments, and went on to become the only Indian to defeat the English East India Company in their own bastion of law and justice, the House of Commons. Throughout his campaign, he retained his Indian identity with great pride. He also fell in love with an English actress and boldly brought her back to India at the height of the War of Independence. And at 46, he lay tragically murdered in the arms of his English lover. I told myself, what a life. His spirited charge in England and his legacy faded with time and got confined to the archives of the British Library. And the British were known for putting anyone who opposed them in footnotes, and that's what he became. He became a footnote in their archives. This untold story needed to be told. Excuse me. What was also vital to understand and articulate and tell was the story of the fall of Surat, Hindustan's greatest port to the English East India Company. The annexation of Surat and the breach of Treaty of 1800 led to the grim situation Mir Jafar Ali Khan found himself in 1856. And so the detailed historical account of the fall of Surat had to be researched, understood, and written. Much has been written about the company's rise to power in India. Accomplished historians have dedicated years of research writing accounts of territorial expansion of the company. The victory Robert Clive achieved in Bengal in Plassey in 1757 has come to be viewed by many historians as the turning point in the English company's fortunes, for it was after that that the company was given the rights to collect revenue on behalf of the weakening Mughal Empire. However, what has remained relatively unknown is that within 2 years of the victory in Bengal, the English ships attacked and stormed the Surat castle in 1759. And for the first time, Hindustan's greatest port had partially fallen to European hands. In the same strain, there has been much written about the iconic clash between Tipu Sultan and Arthur Wellesley, later to be known as the Duke of Wellington. The defeat of Tipu at Mysore in 1799 finds itself in most historical books dedicated to colonial expansion. However, what once again remains relatively unknown is that the following year in 1800, the company under the orders of Arthur Wellesley finally annexed Surat in totality by forcing the Nawab to sign away his administrative powers under a direct threat of forceful English invasion of Surat. Surat had been for centuries arguably India's most cosmopolitan port, with Dutch, Portuguese, English, Baghdadi Jews, Turks trading together with Indian merchants and thriving in maritime trade. All this came to a swift and abrupt end when the English East India Company annexed this glorious port. Subsequent to Mysore and Surat, Delhi fell to the English in 1803, and encouraged by what seemed like a free fall of princely Hindustan, the company went on to annex Satara, Sindh, Punjab, Awadh, and Jhansi. There are many books on all of them and the fate that they suffered at the hands of the company, but in some odd way, the tragic fall of Surat had not got its literary due. But above all this is a true story of a father's epic struggle against the might of the British Empire to safeguard the birthrights of his little girls. I have many people to thank for this effort. Firstly, I have to thank George Michael for not emerging from my grandfather's dusty papers. If he would have emerged, this book would not have been written. I thank Rodi Books, my publishers, and in particular Priya. As she mentioned, Priya, on hearing my story, immediately agreed to publish my yet-to-be-completed work, and she kept her word. I'm very grateful to Dr. Tharoor for taking the time and reading my manuscript and giving a wonderful quote, and above all, sir, for spending some time here and being with me today. I'm grateful to Ashleisha Khurana for the Times of India Surat edition, who organized my visits to the Surat Castle, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English cemeteries, and to the mausoleum of Mir Jafar Ali Khan, and for the research material that she provided. My gratitude for my parents, who have supported me in all endeavors, grows constantly, and thank you for your support in my darkest hours. I'm thankful to my fiancée, Leonie, whose love and understanding has been so crucial for the completion of this book. It was during the writing of this book that we found each other. Without her constant words of encouragement, this book would not have emerged from mere thought and into bounded words. Darling, thank you for all the spaghetti. Finally, I thank my daughters, who come to London every year and visit me, and walk down Warwick Avenue, the street from where their ancestor rose to defy an empire. Thank you.